they could find it quite hard to see the opportunities outside of it. The other one is that this is right for me now, but in 24 months, right? Business agility is so crucial, right? You kind of go, oh, this is the right decision now. Look at the rate of change at the moment. It's absolutely phenomenal, right? There might be a CMS that comes out in 6 months' time that blows everything out of the water. An e-commerce platform that blows things out of the water in 6 months' time. We don't know, right? Having business agility and flexibility, so we're not locked into decisions as well. This is the right decision now. We don't know if it's the right decision in 12 months. We don't know, but we have to have a certain level of business resilience and agility so that we can change.
You're listening to Inside Commerce, a weekly e-commerce strategy, technology and CX-focused podcast hosted by experienced digital consultants and re-platform specialists James Gedd and Paul Rogers. Get insights into e-commerce strategy of leading brands, hear from industry thought leaders and leading tech vendors with practical advice to help you improve your online CX. This podcast is sponsored by Shopify. Our topic today is an interesting one. It's what's the future of CMSs for e-commerce? So looking at the evolution of page builders, where Headless is headed, and also the advent of Gen AI into content generation, and where the PIM space might be evolving to as well, and how those technologies dovetail together. So before I set up why we're talking about this, it's a warm welcome to a guest who's been on previously. So Jim, who's the founder and CTO at Rotate. Hey, Jim, good to have you back on.
Great to be back. Such a short period. I've missed you. It's great to be here.
Excellent. You can't stay away from us, you know. So for those who haven't listened to a previous episode, do you want to give a little bio of who you are and what Rotate is?
Yeah, so Rotate is a kind of composable commerce agency. We've been going for 12 years. I've been a developer I've been coding since the late 90s. But yes, we are a 30-person strong technical partner, and we work with the likes of Rafa and Jamie Oliver, Tracksmith, Big Green Egg, and lots of great brands that we're proud to work with.
Amazing, thank you. And we recently had Jim on along with Seth, who's the VP of Marketing at Commerce, to talk about the impact of AI on coding and how that might change the relationship between agencies and e-commerce brands. We're diving into specifically the CMS side, and because all three of us spend a lot of time working with various brands around like content management strategies or re-platforming and looking at the role the CMS plays within that. And things are changing, and the way different business types use CMSs and what they need from them is changing, and the limitations people face with specific bits of technology can have a pronounced impact on their way of working. So, Paul, do you want to kick off? Let's get this started.
Yeah, absolutely. The only other thing I was going to add for like pre-context is that I think we just all jumped on this and then started to think, actually, let's cover all of the questions in the first half and then maybe move on to kind of how this area is going to evolve and like where AI fits in and everything else. We are riffing a little bit between us, but I personally think it'll be a really interesting discussion. For the first question, so what is the role of a CMS and how does this vary by business type or size? And I guess why do your customers tend to use a CMS and where does it fit?
Yeah, so I suppose like saying in terms of the type of business, I think one thing, within this space that we forget is that not every brand is e-commerce first. Some brands are kind of content first, and e-commerce is actually like a secondary arm to their business. And I think the other thing is actually as businesses evolved, that kind of changes over time. They might be content first and then they kind of move into being e-commerce first and all this kind of stuff. So sometimes it's kind of around that, but often actually as they grow and they change, they kind of hit pain points or they see opportunities, and that's why they kind of bring it in. So it might start off with something like storytelling. I think that's quite a common one. And as native kind of page builders get better, like Shopify, that's less of a demand, but I think storytelling is often one of them. I think sometimes it's just a headless byproduct, which I think is the worst, when it's kind of like, oh, we're going headless and now we're going to need to have a headless CMS as part of this. Sometimes they bring it in as a kind of pseudo PIM. So they bring it in to kind of almost have a very light PIM. So they might not have a massive inventory, but they want to have a light PIM where they have kind of structured, consistent kind of product data. Then you get things like content publishing flows. Actually, the team evolves, there's more people involved, and actually want a better editorial and publishing kind of flow. And then there's also things like multi-headed, right? So it's like, cool, we've just got a store, and then you might have multiple stores on different e-commerce platforms, potentially in different markets. Obviously, traditionally, people have multiple Shopify instances. That's less of a thing now, but there are obviously clients who have licensing agreements and things like this, where actually in different territories, they have completely different e-commerce platforms, or it might be an Alexa skill. It might be, for completely different areas of the business, actually having a consolidated, centralized kind of data or content layer becomes really, really important as a business kind of grows.
Yeah, I think the critical thing here is what type of business and what size and complexity and what does content mean? Because I've worked with we all work with probably relatively different styles of businesses, although there is some, if we put a Venn diagram, there'd be some in the middle that are quite similar. So working with businesses where digital content is purely for online and an e-commerce store, that simplifies the need for content management massively, because you're not doing distributed content and different content formats to different digital outputs. And often then it's looking at a page builder, it's looking at component design, and it's looking at flexible components that can be used in different ways across different user journeys. And the bit that normally is a compromise is the publishing piece, where people are willing to live with not so much depth of publishing control unless they're working in a more global environment where that becomes critical. And then they'll maybe build some additional on top. Where I see the CMS challenge being the hardest for digital teams is where they have like a big store estate and they have digital screens within stores, and they're wanting to put contextually relevant content into different stores based on the location, or whether it's regional store specific, and they've got different screen formats in different places, and they're doing like digital other channels, and they're looking at like interactive on top of it. Then all of a sudden you realize that the role of a CMS is fundamentally different, and the need for workflow based content management and for tighter publishing schedules becomes much, much harder. And that's not so many businesses to do it. But for me, the role of the CMF, that's a totally different acronym. Don't know what that means. But it's really determined by the complexity of the business's content needs.
Yeah, and I think that often changes over time, right? As in, I think as a business becomes more mature, actually their focuses expand, and they kind of realize actually the competitive advantage of having a really strong content arm, and actually how that's, in terms of longevity of the brand and actually building up brand equity, how important that is. And it's consolidating that and having like tools to kind of really supercharge the team around that becomes more and more vital as a business kind of matures quite often.
One thing I was going to add as well, so you mentioned Shopify, and I don't want to eat into the next question because James is going to ask a question in a second around native page builders. But I think it's really interesting with Shopify in particular, because they've obviously like really improved the kind of ability or flexibility around product data. And there is a lot more room for like complex catalogs and, having, complexity within meta fields and everything else. But it does feel like they're still quite far behind from a content perspective. And I think there was a lot of talk a couple of years ago from them around the time they invested in, which CMS did they invest in? I've forgotten.
Sanity.
I thought it was Sanity. Around the time they invested in that, where they were going to introduce like native content models and like a lot more flexibility. But I do feel like, as much as it's very intuitive, I feel like from content models, workflows, schedule, all of that perspective, they're still quite far behind.
What do Mattel, Victoria Beckham, Sennheiser, and Glossier all have in common? They power their businesses with Shopify. Shopify is the most innovative and scaled commerce platform on the planet. It also happens to have the best converting checkout on the planet. Shopify, powering the future of enterprise commerce. Find out more at shopify.com/enterprise.
Yeah, and I think this list bleeds into the next question perfectly, which is about constraint to native page builder. Because when we're looking at tech or content management, you always want to reduce complexity, right? You don't want to add in tools for the sake of it, which might not be used, or might add in additional challenges for like upskilling, learning, and integration. But native page builders, which is where people normally start, have limitations. And one of the big limitations is workflow publishing and the ability, if you're in a team, I've worked with teams where they are making changes to a single page multiple times a day. That's the cadence of their content changes. And a legacy platform like Salesforce, although it's very basic in terms of the interface, one thing it does quite effectively is allow you to schedule content slots and do that and add that complexity. it's not what you want from a modern interface, but the capabilities there. Then you flip to a modern like SaaS product and you look at that, and actually the publishing workflow isn't there. But that's my starting point about there are constraints. But Jim, what do you see in terms of when people are working their way to paid bills? What are the bits that you guys are seeing when you're coming up with the constraints where you have to build workarounds?
Yeah, I think ultimately, looking at this high level, it's a completely different paradigm. It's a completely different relationship, right? Whether you're looking at native CMSs built into something like Craft, or you're looking at native, CMSs built into Shopify, the idea is actually, because it's like this monolithic platform, which has loads of advantages. It's not just, I know composable fanboy, but the key thing is actually your presentation layer and your input is really quite heavily coupled, right? And I know in terms of things like catalog information and stuff, like e-commerce platforms have gotten better with this sort of stuff, but in terms of actually a page, a lot of it is kind of like this one-to-one relationship between input data and like presentational output. A good kind of like headless CMS kind of is way less it cares way less about the final presentation. And the great thing about this is obviously that's the part that you change the most, right? I spout this a lot internally, right? Like the further the technology is away from like the end user, the less you iterate on it, right? So that the front end experience you're constantly iterating on, right? Now, if you've got this one-to-one relationship with data input, that means you can quite quickly, and especially with like the Shopify, code gen stuff that's come out with, block, if you can quickly create blocks and each time you've got new kind of inputs directly for that, and I go, well, quite quickly, you're going to end up in quite a lot of administrative like issues here, unless you then build a layer on top to kind of like manage that at a higher kind of level. So I think at a high level, you kind of go, like the first thing is quite a paradigm shift where you're kind of going, actually, this isn't about building, this is about content first, and kind of going, this is the content, and then think about how that flows into presentation, and accepting that as a business, how you present and how you communicate to your audience is going to change over time. And if you want to change a styling of something, that shouldn't really have much implication to the underlying data. But with the native like platform, it has a real, close and kind of like hard connection. So you've got a few issues, right? You've got these constraints where you've got this one-to-one relationship. Therefore, you've not got generally good underlying structured data that you would like to. It's like, cool, FAQs, like, oh, these are on a product, and then they flow through on an individual like level, or maybe that, how that data interacts with the experience. And I think the kind of over time, you just see these workarounds again and again. And for me, that's like one of the key things where you kind of go, oh, it's time, the time is now, right? When people are kind of duplicating loads of content, like your entire content team are losing their hair because they're just they're inputting the same thing in lots of different locations. And the data becomes more and more kind of unstructured. And then you start leaning on third-party plugins to kind of work around this, rather than stopping and kind of going, actually, we need to clean this up. We need to have a more structured approach. And actually and content data is so imperative for the business that we need to make sure that this is kind of, it's part of IP. So let's make sure that it's kind of like treated as such.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, because one of the limitations without creating hacks, so if you have a standardized component that you want to be able to have in multiple locations, but you update it once and then it populated out to all those pages, you can duplicate things, but you're working on a page template by page template basis. Therefore, you don't have that, I update it here, and I can then make sure it's repopulated to those 6 or 7 places it appears without using more advanced implementations of it. So that, for some teams, that becomes much more painful in terms of a time management piece.
I think my previous point, just to caveat it slightly, I think was probably more for very content-led businesses in terms of where, there's still quite a lot that's needed from a Shopify perspective. But I do think they have improved a lot since they've introduced meta objects and pushed sections since they started moving from that point. That's obviously having a knock-on impact in terms of, I guess, how the market is perceiving headless and the need for more control in this area, and a headless CMS as part of a broader front end stack. From your perspective, how are you seeing these vendors kind of evolving based on the change in this landscape, as Shopify, but others as well, are getting a bit stronger in this area?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the end user, there's I mean, just taking Shopify as an instance, right? There are fewer reasons to go fully headless, like than there were. I mean, I was thinking about a project we did, 8 years ago, right? Where, for Tracksmith, we were headless CMS. Weirdly, we didn't go headless in terms of Shopify. We had a completely headless CMS. And then when you put in the data, it kind of actually created that code and injected it straight into Shopify. But, sorry, I've completely lost my train of thought. But in terms of, there's less of a need now. Sorry, that was my point.
Yeah.
There's less of a need now because as they evolve, when there wasn't markets and things like that, there was obviously less of a need. In terms of like the CMS kind of platforms, in terms of how they're treating things like this, different headless CMS platforms have very different kind of approaches to this, right? So some of them, like Sanity or Contentful, try to be very front end agnostic, and they don't really care about that too much. Then you've got things like, I'd say, Builder.io, and also I'd say even like Storyblock, where they're kind of taking what Shopify's doing. They're kind of creating that one-to-one relationship. It's a very visual first, and they're kind of just mirroring that. I feel this is like quite before it wasn't much of a thing, but as we kind of now get into this place where Shopify is really pushing forward, I think this will be a split. And actually the arguments for moving from something like Shopify to Storyblock, I think are less enticing than they have been previously. I think for something like Sanity, it's just Sanity or Contentful, like it's just a completely different offering, right? So it's a different kind of like construct that they're kind of like pushing. So yes, did that answer your question, Cole? I went on a ramble, so I'm not sure.
I think it does. And I think it's kind of bits of what you were saying there, definitely. I think another thing that I think we might see is more consolidation around third parties that support a core ecom platform. So like AM is a good example where you're seeing some CMS vendors like invest more time in terms of like media storage and like manipulation. And I feel we'll see more of that, maybe PIM as well, potentially. But this kind of takes me on a little bit to the next question. So I think you talked a bit about, within the last editions and within Shopify's New Horizons stuff, they've moved to kind of the ability to use AI to build a component. And maybe there's a bit more kind of no code shifting in terms of managing content on the front end generally. How do you think this will change how brands, and I guess that's just Shopify, but then alongside Shopify, and we obviously have tried to avoid just making things about Shopify. Well, obviously they are a big proportion of the industry and everything else. But alongside that, you've got all the kind of no code paid builders as well, and other platforms that are kind of targeting that same space. How do you think that will change how people look at these page builder solutions and CMS solutions?
Yeah, from a Gen AI perspective specifically,
I think as a result of that shift, where maybe they're almost training people, and I think the same applies with some of the other CMS solutions out there, like more fully featured CMS solutions. Do you think that's kind of maybe training the industry to think that they don't necessarily need it?
Yeah, I mean, I think again that there's definitely a fork in the road, right? Where you're getting some places where kind of going, actually, we're going to try and know more, like some CMSs that saying, we're going to try and know more of this, right? We're going to try and own personalization. We're going to try and own like insights, where, cohort segmentation, all this kind of stuff. And they're trying to own more and more and more. And I think that's where it's going to get quite a tension point, because obviously Shopify owns so much of it, right? And you're either going to, as people already do, you already, see obviously lots of vendors kind of going, cool, we're going to push search to Algolia, we're going to push this to this. And I think that's where you kind of get the tension for platforms, because now more than ever, some of these headless platforms are really, really overlapping. I would say Sanity, Contentful, less so. I'd say like Builder.io, Storyblock to a lesser extent, Dato to a lesser extent. They are, there is that kind of like friction. And you're right, totally, in terms of things like media management and DAM and taking that over. I mean, I feel you look at some, people like Cloudinary and stuff, it's like, oh, this is quite challenging, because actually it's quite convenient to kind of go, actually, this is already stored here. We don't have to connect to a third party DAM. This stuff is kind of pretty evolved now in terms of what people are looking for in terms of the DAM. So Yes, I think it is pushing forward. And I think we are kind of going to end up in a real kind of tension point. I think the CMSs that are going to like do well out of this are the ones who have a differentiated kind of like paradigm within this. Like Gen AI looks so different in something like Builder compared to something like Sanity, right? Because Sanity doesn't care about the presentation. The sort of Gen AI stuff it's doing is kind of going, cool. You've got this audience. Say, for instance, we're doing this with like brands at the moment. We've got an audience and there's quite different cohorts, right? And we do really rich kind of personalization where we're saying, actually, we've got an audience that are 70 to like 80. We've got an audience that are 20 to 30. We want the same page to communicate so differently to these people, reference different products, like different kind of tone of voice, all this kind of stuff. And you're like, cool. Well, this can all be automated from a content perspective with AI, and Sanity's technology at the moment does such a great job at these sort of tasks. So you kind of go, cool, that's great. And then also things like, I'm launching in Japan. Cool. I want to translate every piece of content we've done, even though it's all really structured from a data perspective. I want to translate it all into Japanese. Here's like my tone of voice for the Japanese market. Da, 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 da. So that's what kind of, I suppose, Gen AI looks like in that space. And it's a mixture of, generating like truly new content, transforming content to kind of, different image. I mean, even different imagery, right? You imagine like an ecom page, right? And you're talking about the benefits of, the client moment, talking about the benefits of collagen, right? Now, if I'm talking to a younger audience or an older audience, the sort of models I want to be using in that, I want to be pulling different kind of assets in. So it's more relatable and it's more compelling a story, right? Now, I know we have, and this is the spectrum of personalization, right? But quite often personalization doesn't need to be really completely unique to everyone. And you kind of go, actually, no, I do want to have more curated experience, manually curated experience for like tighter cohorts. And for things like that, that's the sort of space that someone like Sanity, and even like Contentful is kind of like where they are. Whereas obviously Shopify is looking at this from okay, it's got translations and stuff, but it's looking at it from quite a different perspective, right? It is more kind of tied to that actual end experience, and it's more kind of tied to like generating code and actual like front-end experiences. And Builder is actually doing this sort of stuff as well. So they're just turning to very different kind of types of platforms, and where it kind of settles, I'm not really sure. Helpful answer, right?
No, I think this is a really important conversational point, because the ecosystem that you are sat in as a business will influence where you go with tooling. Because if you are take Centra, for example, by default, you are not using a native page builder. Therefore, you're using a third-party CMS. And I think then it changes the dynamic in how businesses think about content from a strategic level as part of a project to launch on the platform, because you're not working within a constraint of a theme. You're not working in a constraint of that capability. You're thinking about what is the content that you need. And then you are also thinking about future. Well, I might not be ready for personalization. I might not have the bandwidth in my team to generate the assets that drive personalization for 5-6 segments, even if I've got a really cool bit of AI able to help on that. But I'm going to be there in 24 months and I need my tool ready for that. If you go down the locked-in route where you're using a page builder, yes, the capabilities will extend, but they're never going to get to that level. I cannot see that happening in the foreseeable future. Then you've got the other dynamics on that, which is what else might you be trying to achieve from a site content point of view in terms of like SEO, URL structures, analytics and data for everything you want to track, which informs your analysis that then drives your optimization of your content, your merchandising, etc., which should be thought of in the terms of content management. Because what can you put from a data layer and an analytics tracking point of view without having loads of extra third party? So you get all of these additional dependencies you need to think about in terms of where you are now and where you're in the future. And I think the ecosystem point is really important, because the platform you buy into will have pros and cons for all of those areas.
Such a massive point. That's such a massive point. I love it, because there's a few things you said that really, really resonated. One is that actually people, when they're in an ecosystem, they find it quite hard to see outside of it. They find it quite hard to see the opportunities outside of it. The other one is that you said like, oh, this is right for me now, but in 24 months, right? Business agility is so crucial, right? You kind of go, oh, this is the right decision now. And it's like, no one knows. Look at the rate of change at the moment. It's absolutely phenomenal, right? There might be a CMS that comes out in 6 months' time that blows everything out of the water. An e-commerce platform that blows things out of the water in 6 months' time. We don't know, right? And having business agility and flexibility, so you can kind of go, look, we're not locked into decisions as well. This is the right decision now. We don't know if it's the right decision in 12 months. Like, we don't know, but we have to have a certain level of business resilience and agility so that we can change. I think this is why I'm always banging the drummer out of composability. I know I'm so boring about it, but that for me is the fundamental core thing about composability. Just kind of giving business agility and saying, actually, you know, you make the right decision now, that will change, your business will change, like opportunities and challenges will change. And so you need to be kind of adaptable, especially in a time where technology is moving at a rate that I've never seen. It's like totally exciting, but also from a merchant's perspective, probably quite scary at the same time.
I think I just wanted to comment on that because I mean we could do a whole episode on this, but I actually think one of the biggest variables in the industry and all the ecosystems and everything else right now is that speed of change thing and the speed that technology and businesses are moving at. And I think I was going to do a big post about it, actually. But I decided not to. But I think it's the easiest it's ever been to build something from a tech, from any perspective right now, like business and tech. And I think it's the hardest it's ever been to scale something. And I think the reason for that, I mean, I have seen so many people build products that are like insane and they're so good. And they've got to a certain point, they've got to a certain level of usage. And then suddenly a load of other vendors in the industry will introduce that functionality, and or you will get additional vendors go and raise 20 million VC money and then blow them out of the water. And then suddenly this company is pivoting. And I just think there's this crazy cycle at the minute. And it's amazing for innovation, but I think it's really scary. But yeah, it's nuts. And like the speed that you're seeing these businesses move at is just ridiculous. This is a bit of a tangent, to be honest, but I think you talked about it, and I actually don't think that many people are talking about it. And I think it's nuts out there.
Yeah, great point. Really good.
We'll carry on with the podcast now that I feel.
I'm waiting for that post though, Paul. I will wait for that post. I think it's such a really, really important point, right? And like saying it's easier to spin stuff up now than ever, and actually being able to adapt and change once you're kind of there is that much more challenging. And you said new tools are kind of popping up every day, and it's like, how do you navigate that? So the one thing for Shopify is like their rate of evolution is pretty amazing. Like, I don't know a business that invests in R&D like they do. It's insane. And I suppose the one thing is, you know, actually, the tough thing is that your innovation and what's right for your business might not perfectly align, but they are bringing you things all the time, which is a great competitive advantage in itself. But it might be that actually quite often with a certain size of business maturity, that actually the things that are unique to your business that really differentiates you in the market aren't going to be things that come out of the box, which I think is where it kind of gets a bit challenging. But anyway, another podcast.
Yeah, and that'd be an interesting discussion, because I think talking about this in the context of Shopify as well is super interesting. And I think there's so many things that they're doing that are like under the radar that are just going to make them so hard to compete with for anyone else. But yeah, we'll skip this and move back to the podcast. Yeah.
Back to the podcast.
Well, Paul has finished his party political broadcast for Shop. And now we will talk about a technology agnostic CMS. But it is an interesting because the whole point of this episode is to help e-commerce teams, people working in e-commerce teams, understand where the industry's going, what the implications are, how you make better decisions. And the reality is the speed of change in the Shopify ecosystem, it does create a warp of perspective. And I'm not meaning that from a critical point of view, but I think sometimes that makes it hard for people to then understand the differences and the pros and cons between different platforms, approaches, etc. So, I mean, let's come on to another question, because I think this is an interesting one as well, which is the CMSs are rapidly evolving, whether that's headless vendors increasing their capabilities. You were talking, Jim, earlier about the personalization capabilities of some Sanity, or a page builder, launching its Gen AI capability and improving its publishing capabilities. So at what point are these tools going to make the need for a PIM superfluous, or will a PIM always, from a content management point of view, play a fundamental role? Because you've got, Paul, you're talking about before we start recording, modern PIMs like Emphas, who are doing some really cool things, and they're building in content capabilities So Gen AI capability, translations around like SEO stuff. So is there a convergence, or is the PIM side, come to you first, is the PIM side changing away from its core around just structured product data?
Yeah, I mean, I think with all of these things, and I think that, in terms of like, I suppose, motivations for even going headless in the first place, right? There has to be a business case for it. I think so often there isn't, right? Which is kind of crazy. And the same thing for a PIM, sorry. You've got to look at what your business's opportunities and challenges are, the impact this is going to make, and just like ground it in business kind of like reasoning, right? So if you've got a small for us, for the clients we work with, if they've got a smallish catalog, we won't use a PIM quite often. We'll use, we pretty much exclusively work with headless CMSs, and we'll use a headless CMS to kind of as a PIM, a light PIM, right? And actually, like Jamie Oliver, for instance, I mean, it's not a PIM, but a huge, enormous recipe database, like decades of, and it's like, cool. It was kind of structured in a pretty chaotic way, and it's like, okay, no, this is almost like a PIM of sorts, right? And actually, we're going to store this, have the data structured, and all this kind of stuff. So I think in terms of the role of the PIM, a lot of the things that the PIM is doing, and emphasis, in terms of like some of the AI stuff, it's quite similar to some of the headless, headless CMS kind of like moves as well. In terms of kind of going, actually, we're going to, and you can build on top of it as well. So with Sanity, for instance, you might kind of go, here's the main information about a product, and then it will kind of just decorate all these additional things based on that from an AI perspective. If that's not supported, you can build your own kind of AI actions and all this kind of stuff. So there will be, a point, but ultimately the PIM differentials will be the kind of ones that they always were, right? Which is kind of going, okay, so I want to quickly look up, like products, I want certain reporting on the kind of like product inventory and all this kind of stuff. So I think at scale, the arguments for a PIM are still there. I don't think the CMS will take over. And I think as CMS tries to take over that space, you'll end up with a pretty crappy product because it won't be focused on actually what its core kind of intent is meant to be. So as I said, for me, for a business with not enormous product catalog, I would argue generally you're going to be fine with a good headless CMS, like the structured data in there. For a business with enormous catalog, I'd still at the moment recommend using a dedicated PIM.
That makes sense. And the next one, so kind of going back to the kind of core use cases for headless CMS. So under what circumstances have you seen the need for a headless CMS, and when isn't it needed? And one thing I would say as well, because I know that you guys are very well known for your work in the composable space and headless, but I know you also do work with like Liquid. And I guess, do you ever use any of these specialist third parties in situations where you're not actually working on a headless build?
Yeah, so I mean, the signs that a business, as I said, like previously, like ultimately, it has to start with a business case. I know you guys would be advocates for that, right? Like, actually, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities as a business? Does this make sense bringing this in? Because obviously, when you bring in headless CMS, it often brings in a lot of other kind of like caveats and trade-offs, and so you've got to be really intentional about it. Signs that a business kind of like needs to move to something like that. I said, like, your content team are completely stressed out their minds. Productivity and velocity has like massively kind of gone down. You're hacking the platform. Like, that's such a classic one. Like, you would have all seen it. You go into, your e-com platform of choice and you look at it, it's like, you've hacked the system to make this work. And actually, therefore, the editorial, experience has become absolutely horrific. And obviously, then, kind of content, you've got lots of content that's living outside of the, like the native kind of platform in spreadsheets and Notion, all this kind of stuff. Your editorial processes are really slow and repetitive. Data is duplicated and inconsistent. Ultimately, the way I see a headless CMS is, I'm going like, the primary user is the end user, right? They're the people buying the products, whatever. But then the next most important user is like the actual editorial, the editorial kind of like user. And it's like, if I can improve their productivity, if I can improve their workflow, how's that going to impact the business, right? How's that going to impact them in terms of how fast they can move, their kind of like competitive advantage? And I think that's where it comes really messy, because you look at this and you kind of go, you're hacking around the system so much. This is crazy what you're having to do. And ultimately, what you've realized is we've now built a team, we've built processes and a team around a platform rather than designing a solution around a team and their objectives. And I think fundamentally that's what it kind of comes down to. You kind of go, oh, we've got all these people and they're all working and they're doing all these hacks to kind of like create what they want to create. It's like, no, this is utterly crazy. What are you trying to achieve? Now let's just design. And that's a great thing with like these headless CMSs, they're so flexible. You can completely design the interface. And if you want to kind of go, you click one little tick box and that creates like loads of blocks of all this information pulled in data from, you can do that, right? But it's understanding how we accelerate, how we empower like, merchant teams to kind of move faster than they would be able to otherwise.
Yeah, and I'd like to come back to the Jamie Oliver example, actually, and I think it'd be interesting for people to hear that migration path and building into Headless and what the development benefits, but also the benefits to merchants, but some of the challenges. So yeah, I'd love to, like, if you could pull out a few highlights from that process. And also a few gotchas about what people need to think about, because if people are thinking, right, we're constrained, actually, we should be going to a specialist CMS. We know, like, the path is not littered with gold. There's always challenges. So what were the I guess, developmental benefits for you, and what are a couple of the key learnings through that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think from our side, from an agency side, we want to empower the client as much as possible. So we want to design a system where it empowers them as much as possible. We don't want to be doing anything that is not completely unique to what we can do. So if we can design a system that completely empowers them, kind of, oh, I can spin up, these, loads of different landing pages. I can do personalization. I can do experimentation. I can do this all without an engineer. That's great, because then the things that we're working on are the things that are truly unique to us, where we're adding the highest kind of value. And I think that's, where we often, we don't want to be fighting the system. We want to empower the client. So well, combined velocity is as fast as possible. In terms of Jamie Oliver, they were like battling with multiple WordPress kind of like databases. One of those was a database of recipes, which is, as you can imagine, absolutely enormous because it's decades worth of recipes. The data really poorly structured. And from them, we're like, look, this is like your intellectual property. This is JamieOliver.com, their recipes is kind of like their primary, intellectual property, right? So you kind of go, we need to kind of put this on the pedestal it deserves. Now that just sits in a headless CMS. And the migration path for that was obviously, to be honest, it was way quicker than someone might think. Within a week, we built a migration script, which kind of just went into all these different kind of like databases and then kind of remodeled the data. And an engineer spent just under a week kind of like designing that migration kind of like script. And then obviously that kind of, and then that was run. And then all the kind of recipes in a way more structured format, things, and once it's more structured, you can kind of go, okay, let's look up the average time for a chicken recipe. Let's look at, like, you can leverage that data in way more intuitive ways. And if you think for them as a business, having that as a really accessible, good content structured data means that they can leverage that IP in a multitude of ways that wasn't really possible when it was this kind of weird one-to-one relationship with kind of like presentation and all this kind of stuff. And when you're looking at like a migration like that, you might kind of, some of it, quite often you kind of go, actually, we're migrating this content, but in addition to that, we have these extra fields that we want to capture now, additional data. Like Gen AI is really good in this, in this instance where you kind of say, actually, we're going to pull this information in, but we also now need this information, and the core, like the data's in there, but it's not in a format that we want it in. So you might say there's a description and we're going to use that to pull out, say for instance, you had a big content block and it has all the ingredients in it. And you say, cool, okay, AI, pull out the ingredients from this, structure this in this format instead, and do this. And I think that's where things kind of get really nice, where it's that sort of, that kind of play where you kind of go, actually, this is where AI is just way more effective, right? Otherwise, we're writing a script to kind of go, read through this, look up it against a database of ingredients, pull these things out. So that's where you kind of see those kind of real benefits in terms of speed, adding a light touch of AI just to kind of get the data to a better place. As I said, once the data's there, how you can leverage that, especially in the space we're in at the moment, especially like with technology moving on so quickly, having really clear, clean, underlying data, structured data is so powerful. AI is only as good as the data and the contextual awareness you're kind of giving it. And actually, if you format that in a structured way, like, you're going to be setting yourself up for success.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Where I'm potentially seeing the future, like divergence in terms of when people stick the native versus going to specialists, is I think the publishing and workflow thing, or at least like core publishing capability, will be solved by the likes of Shopify relatively soon. I know it's being worked on. I don't know when, but so I don't think where people have simple, non-high level personalized content needs and non-complex user journeys, I don't think the publishing thing will be an issue in the future. But where I think it will be where the style of the data and the structure of it needs to be closely controlled and manipulated and used in different ways for different user journeys or different user types. I can definitely see where that will be a future-proof thing for brands. But Paul, where's your? Let's do some parting thoughts on this. Where are you seeing this going in terms of the type of when page builders are going to be solving the need for the business versus when actually these specialist CMS composable approach is actually going to be beneficial?
So I personally think the need for what is available on the market today will shrink pretty quickly. However, I think those solutions will evolve and double down on more advanced functionality within the areas they're already covering. I think they'll start to do more in the DAM space. I think they'll have their own AI capabilities. I think, personalization, segmentation, reporting. I think there'll be, and I think this applies as a rule to the whole industry. Like, I think businesses like Shopify are just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then the specialist solutions are just going to have to double down on functionality that they will never be able to get quite as deep in. That's kind of where I think that we'll go. I think these solutions will just go broader around content and automation and anything around it.
Yeah. And Jim, your parting thoughts and wisdom for the masses?
Wisdom, I'm not sure about that, but yes, I completely agree with everything that kind of like Paul said, right? I think a lot of the kind of fundamental CMS functionality that's been there for a long time, Shopify will, they'll lock it down, they'll get it out, and they'll kind of push it out. I think the reality is obviously Shopify is trying to do a lot of things, right? Whereas if you're a dedicated CMS, you're quite, you're more narrowly focused. I think the CMSs that stay narrowly focused, it will serve them well, because they'll be able to drive innovation in a much kind of smaller space. So someone like Sanity is an example. As I said, right now, I can build a workflow in Sanity where I kind of write some content and I say run workflow. It will then do the translations. It will create multiple versions for different different cohorts. It will, set up an approval process for for my boss. Not that I don't, but it will do all these things for me, right? And that's where it's at. That's where it's at now. I mean, and when Shopify brings this thing, Sanity will move on in all these different ways.
Yeah. But
they're focused, and that's why I like them. They're focused on that narrow kind of we're going to do this one thing. We're going to do it really well, probably better, than anyone. And Shopify won't be able to catch up on that. But what Shopify will do is move ahead in so many other ways. And I suppose it's like when you kind of go as a merchant, it's actually worth making that move. All these extra things that this does, is it worthwhile when actually Shopify is covering 90% or 80-90% of my use cases?
I think the only other thing I would say as well is I think we talk about Shopify in today's state as well, where they are definitely reducing room for some vendors. But I do also think Shopify's long-term play and long-term monetization strategy is probably quite different to what it is today. Like, I think, a lot will be a play on the data that they own. I think there'll be a bigger play around ads. I think they'll monetize the platform and the ecosystem more. And I think with all of that, there'll be additional opportunity.
Excellent. So that's been really interesting. Thanks as always for joining us, Jim. And if anyone listening wants to debate what we said, chat about it in more detail, or even challenge us and tell us we're talking complete nonsense, do reach out. You can contact all of us on LinkedIn. I hope you've enjoyed that episode. Until next time, everyone.
You're listening to the Inside Commerce podcast hosted by experienced consultants James Gerd and Paul Rogers. Inside Commerce is your fast track to digital knowledge, featuring interviews with leading e-commerce retailers, industry thought leaders, and the C-suite of key tech companies to explore the latest in digital strategy, customer experience, and tech. Discover what the latest trends really mean and get practical advice based on experience to help fine-tune your e-commerce strategy and tech stack. Follow us on LinkedIn and reach out to James or Paul if you'd like to discuss an e-commerce project. We hope you enjoy the latest episode.